Welcome, my name is Colleen Tauke and I'm the sewing specialist here at Fons and Porter. In this Sew Easy, I'm going to show you how to make bias strips for applique. You can see in the quilt behind me that there are stems that run down through the columns that the flowers and leaves come off of, and those are bias strips. We need to use a bias cut fabric because it has flexibility and can create those waves without curling. And there are at least three ways to do that. And I'm going to show you those three here in the studio. The first one is to, after you've cut all of your bias strips, and I'm going to use a different color than green so you can see it on the mat, is to create those bias pieces. Now, the reason why we do bias is because it has stretch and flexibility. The fun part is trying to figure out how to make those really narrow strips. One thing we can do is use bias bars. Now these are a heat-resistant nylon, and they come in a variety of widths, all usually in one packet. We're going to use the wider one here today so that it's easier for you to see. And what you do is you follow instructions with the packet. It'll tell you to take the width of the bar and add seam allowances. So what we're going to do is have it enough so that we can slide it inside kind of a casing. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take one of these strips over to the sewing machine, and we're going to just sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance along one edge. When you're first working on these, you think, it doesn't seem like there's enough fabric left behind to actually create a bias strip, but trust me, it works. Okay, we need a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The trick is getting it under the presser foot. There we go. And I'm just going to sew a portion of this. Because it's bias, it's going to have some give as it's going into the sewing machine, but don't worry about that. It can snap back because it is cut on the bias. So we're just going to sew a portion of that. And now we've created kind of a casing there. And what you'll do is once you've sewn all the way along, you're going to insert that bias bar inside of that pocket like that. It comes out the other side here. And you can work it along the strip as you're working on it. What we want to do is rotate that strip so that the seam allowance is down one side of the bar. And see how it's a slippery surface, so it's easy to rotate. And then what we're going to do is take it to the ironing board. They're heat resistant, and I'm going to iron that seam allowance to one side with the bar inside. Drive that seam allowance in one direction. Get it really warm so it gets a good press. Don't be afraid of the heat at this point because that bar is a nylon. Now I've pressed the seam allowance in one direction so that when I take the bar out, I'm going to take it back to the ironing board and press. So the seam allowance is going to be on the bottom side, and it will be hidden on the back side of this strip. Good press. And now you can see the seam allowance is going to be hidden under here, and I can apply that to my background, and I can make that curve and make that wave down through the quilt. And there won't be any seams that pop out. I'd have a nice even, you can do applique stitch, you could do a hidden stitch, whatever your favorite edge finish is going to be for your bias strips at that point. So that's using the bias bar. Now another way to create those bias strips is to, I've got an extra here, is to use a bias tape maker. And this is a tool that's produced by, I believe Clover produces this one. And it will tell you what size. The finished width here is the finished width of the strip as it comes out, and that's the piece that you would be using for your applique. And it will tell you in the instructions that come along with the tool how wide to cut your strips. But it is simply inserted into the back of the tool like this, with the right side of the fabric outside, away from, or pointing towards your tabletop in this instance. And you can see if you diagonally cut your tip, the little piece of fabric is going to come out the end there. As it just starts to come out the end, we're going to take this to the ironing board and we're going to press as it comes out of the tool. So I'm going to step over. I'm going to pull out just a little piece of it and kind of get it started. And then there's kind of a handle on the tool that I can, as I'm pulling the tool to my right, I can then kind of keep up with the iron and do the same thing and just keep moving along the strip so that I create a bias tape underneath there. And you can see it turns the edges under, and then I have this perfect bias strip, and I can use that for my stems or the vine in the quilt behind me. So that's one way, just pulling it through the tool and using the iron to do the rest of the work. Now another method is to take pins and put them into your ironing board surface and create yourself kind of a channel to run your bias strip through. So we'll do just down into the ironing board surface with a hat pin, and we'll do a second one here. We can run our pieces through kind of a channel. They call this grandmother's method, so it's been around a long time on how to get a bias strip slid underneath there and use the iron to your advantage. Now, if we just start with one just kind of turned under to get it started to go under that channel, we'll just iron a bit of it. We need to get it to go under our pins, and then the pins are the idea of the pin will then guide the rest of our turn along that channel to create a bias strip. Not too much steam there, I'll burn my fingers. Okay. We're going to feed it under those pins. Get it started under there. Might take a little bit. There we go. Now it's going. Probably just with one pin we can do this. Once I've got it started, it starts to curl and feed under that pin. And then you can do the same thing as that tool. As you pull, you can see that the fabric slides under there. It stays the width of the pinned area and creates the same kind of bias strip that you created with the tool, but without it. So you have perfect bias for your stems and your vines in the quilt behind me. If you'd like to see more of our Sew Easy techniques and tutorials, please visit our website. Thanks for joining me today.